Welcome back, everybody. This is Derek Kirby with the Dallas Prospect, back to talk some more Mavericks basketball. And I'm joined once again by Saad Yusuf of The Athletic and 1310 The Ticket, or sorry, 96.7/1310 The Ticket, as it were. Saad, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm pretty good, pretty good. There's definitely a lot to still kind of talk about on the Mavericks front, and the more I've kind of continued to think back on that introductory press conference and everything, the more I kind of wonder if there's more to delve into, if there's more layers that I haven't necessarily considered yet. I posted a video yesterday. A subscriber to the channel who speaks Latvian actually sent me a transcript, a translated transcript from a KP interview he did with a Latvian YouTube channel that was pretty interesting, I thought. And it basically KP, and you've seen some of those quotes kind of floating around today, actually, I think on social media. KP basically saying like, I was put in an awkward situation, just kind of like stuck in the corner and not used properly, just kind of had to soldier on. He talked about that, and he also kind of talked about like, look, I don't need to be the top guy. I just have to feel like I'm being utilized properly. And you can kind of sense from that the frustration that he's had with it, and that's obviously been documented. But I've looked at stuff like that, but even on that front, I wanted to get back to comments from Jason Kidd, comments from Mark Cuban, and the Mavericks as a whole as it relates to KP. So figured I'd bring you on, talk about some of that, and we can get into some of those other subjects as well, whether it be the situation with the GM or shadow GM, as it were, and Jason Kidd, Luka-Doncic on court, I know you mentioned. So yeah, I wanted to delve right into that. What are you thinking? What are you thinking off the bat? What was your takeaway from the introductory press conferences?
Well, it was yeah. I mean, I agree. There's a lot to get into, and I think that the introductory press conference was kind of interesting because usually these things go one of two ways, and I would say more times than not they go the way that the Mavericks press conference went, and that is that it's very I would say bland. It's those same cliche cookie cutter questions of,
Mm-hmm.
how excited are you about Luka, or what does he do well? Oh, he does everything well. And it's the same stuff. And you saw those questions being posed to the Mavericks brass up on the stage the same way, like just in different words, but the same questions. And I think what those kind of press conferences, the reason why they're so interesting is because you have to then look at the timing of answers. When did someone butt in? How did someone look? And like, there's just a lot more to dissect. And I think an interesting one was when I forgot who it was. Someone posed a question to Jason Kidd and Nico Harrison, and I think that's when it was about Kristaps Porzingis, and
Mm-hmm.
Mark Cuban wasn't even asked the question about KP, and
Yeah.
yet before you can move on to the next answer, he voluntarily butt in and kind of made it a point to say, "Hey, KP did exactly what he was asked to do, aka what he was coached to do in
Yep.
the playoffs, and so don't be mad at him." So, that's both backing KP while also taking a shot at the departed coach, while also welcoming in the new coach. It's like a 3-on-1, it's a three-headed monster that you just don't see coming. So those kind of things are my main takeaways from the press conference.
Yeah, it was definitely a multi-pronged comment, like you said, where it's the implication lashes out in multiple directions there. It's like positive and encouraging on one front and another, and then at the same time, kind of a backhanded criticism in that regard as it relates to the departed Rick Carlisle. So, yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that KP, just based on what we saw in the regular season and everything like that, it felt like Dallas never really made an effort to make a counter. Like we saw, like with the Clippers putting Kawhi more on KP, Dallas was just like, oh, okay, I guess we just leave him in the corner, and he kind of just stayed there for the most part. Like KP mentioned in that interview I talked about yesterday, like in terms of his shot production and all that, like the looks he was getting, it was cut by half. And so it's like, well, yeah, of course his numbers are going to drop off. He was a basically 2010 guy in the regular season, and his production and everything dropped off significantly in the playoffs. And he understands that, as a max contract guy, he doesn't really have the freedom in that case to kind of complain about it, other than to say, like, I can offer more. I just did what I was told was best for the team, and if it had paid out in a series win, then I think he probably would have continued to buy into that. But it kind of felt like, I don't know, like, he did what he was asked. I don't think he believed in what he was asked, especially by the end once they blew the 2-0 lead and lost in 7. So yeah, it's a delicate situation with Porzingis, because they have to, one, if they actually do still believe, as they tell us they do, that they can kind of salvage his tenure with Dallas, that they can make it work with him and Luka. If they believe that, they need to keep him built up and knowing, like, hey, no, we understand, we're fixing it, we fixed it, like, it's fine, we're going to do better going forward, we know where we went wrong. And as it relates to the possibilities of all these trade scenarios people are throwing out, it's like, on that front, you kind of have to signal to the rest of the league, like, oh no, there's no problems here. What, concerns over jealousy with Luka's kind of popularity amongst that and how he gets all the credit? No, that's not a thing. He's unfairly maligned. Like, I think the answer is somewhere in between. But yeah, it is interesting how I don't know necessarily what they actually think about his future moving forward with the team, or if it's more a matter of trying to keep the perception as positive as possible, so you maybe can keep that door open for more trade talks and stuff, whether it be now, and I don't think it would be, or the summer, or hell, even the deadline, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's two things to come from your point there, and I think that's, it's probably their way that they are thinking. But another thing that comes with that territory is it's not just about the perception. Like, at the end of the day, like, you hear it a lot in the NBA. It's a make or miss league, right? So like you have to have these players performing well. It's not just about how they're perceived, or what their locker room reputation is. At the end of the day, they got to ball out. And the thing with KP, though, is if he starts balling out, the only way for him to truly reach a trade value that is something legitimate, that the Mavericks would even entertain,
Mm-hmm.
he would have to start performing really well. But if he does at that point, then do you even want to trade him? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
it's that really murky middle ground where it's like, as soon as the reason you do want to trade him right now is because you don't think he's a good fit, you think that he's underperforming, all that kind of stuff. Well, if he starts performing up to standards, then yeah, his trade value is there. But isn't that what the whole point was, to get to him, to get him to that point? So that's why, a KP trade seems very unlikely to me, just because, like, again, by the time he gets to a point where he has good trade value, then you're just going to want to keep him.
For sure. And there's a lot to consider even within that, right? Like, I agree. If he's playing up to snuff, where he actually has trade value that's worthwhile, where you're getting something in return and not just a bag of beans, then yeah, you want to keep him. I would also say, though, if the kind of reports that are out there with kind of this perceived jealousy and everything towards Luka, like, if it's not working in terms of like chemistry, then maybe at that point you do still open the door to say, hey, okay, great, he's playing better, but if we're still having some of these issues and it's still like an internal distraction, maybe we still consider a trade possibility. But even then, you kind of wonder, like, all right, these reports and everything of his frustration and kind of jealousy and things like that, has that been the case all along? Or is it magnified by his struggles and his frustration with how he was utilized in the playoffs? You know what I mean? Like, Bubble KP, during that run before the playoff bubble in Orlando, were there any issues internally with him and Luka? Not that we ever heard about, and both of them were absolutely balling out of their minds. So maybe the solution is just for KP to kind of get back into that form where, like you said, you don't even want to trade him anymore and you're content. But if it is something where even if he's playing up to par, but it is still somewhat of a problem, then maybe at that point you do consider some of those other avenues and hopefully have a better outlook than you would if you moved him like today, for example.
Yeah, and so yeah, and I think that's a good point. I just think that another cliche to fall back on: winning cures all. And when you see, when you're winning, when you're having success, at the end of the day, I mean, if the Mavericks move past the clip, if the Mavericks move past the Clippers in the first round of the playoffs and they even go to, give a competitive series in the second round or even move on from there, I don't know how much of the KP stuff specifically. Now, I think a lot of the front office stuff was a long time coming. That was not something that happened out of the blue. But the KP stuff would like automatically kind of be resolved in some ways. And a good example of that is literally the team that's in the NBA Finals right now,
Yep.
because remember, Mike Budenholzer, the coach for the Bucks, he's been on the hot seat every single day for as long as this playoff run has been going on. And it's always like, okay, if they lose in the conference finals, is he going to be out as coach? And all of a sudden, they're one win away from winning the NBA championship. You're not going to fire the coach after you win an NBA championship. So again, winning cures all. And I think that's the thing with the Mavericks too. If you go back, not this past season, but the one before, and you look at that late January to mid-March run when Luka hurt his ankle again, but KP was coming back from his knee injury, and then Luka came back like right around the All-Star break. That run that these two guys had was incredible. Like I remember I was, still writing about the Mavericks for The Athletic. I was doing film breakdowns, and it was just so much fun because basketball just looked so poetic when they were at it with each other. And I think, the fact that they've shown that they're capable of doing that should give Mavericks fans and even the Mavericks brass some hope. And I think that's where there's also this fine line that you were talking about earlier. Is it just false positivity to like kind of like boost morale, or is it real? I think there is a little bit of both. Like I think I think it's legitimate. Like they've seen that it can work before. So they're just kind of banking on, all right, like it worked for a month or two back then. Why not just try to make it work again and then hopefully string together basically 3 years,
Yeah, no, I agree for sure. And that is something like Kidd said in the press conference. A direct quote that initially came from it was him saying KP is a perfect fit next to Luka. And I think there's a lot KP has to grow in his game. And the benefit of the doubt I'm giving him, especially as it relates to last year, I don't think he was ever completely right last year. I think between the short off season that preceded it, which was like 7 weeks from NBA Finals to preseason, between that and him having to recover from the meniscus surgery, which he didn't even get right away, it seemed like they wanted it to try and see if it could heal naturally. And then when that wasn't going to work within a timetable, they got the surgery, and that's why he missed the first 10 games. And even then, maybe should have waited a little longer to come back, but health and safety protocols forced him into that move. He didn't get a chance to kind of go and get in his bag, if you know what I mean. Like Luka, this past offseason, he came back and suddenly the mid-range game is like this lethal weapon he now has that he didn't so much possess the prior year. And the three-point shooting for Luka had a huge spike as well, although a slow start. Like you saw aspects of his game that directly came back stronger, perceived weaknesses that came back stronger the following year. KP didn't have that opportunity last offseason. And he acknowledged in the exit interviews this year that, when I came into the league, the unicorn thing really did stick because there wasn't really anyone who could do what I did, and even fewer who could actually kind of guard and deal with that. Well, now it's a little more commonplace. It's basically a 5-out situation at this point. And so he acknowledged himself like, yeah, I have to go evolve my game. I have to find those next steps. So I'm hoping with this being a full off season, no rehab or anything like that, he actually does get that opportunity to work on it. As I see some people in the comments pointing out, like, yeah, KP off the dribble has not been good. And Rick even kind of had a veiled allusion to that, like a perfect fit in his exit interview. He was saying a perfect fit next to Luka was someone who can do basic things off the bat, like off a single dribble or something like that. And KP working off the dribble has not been a strong thing in his Mavericks tenure. So maybe that's the kind of thing he can add to it. I am hopeful, like you are, that they can find a balance because we've seen it in at least a microcosm of a couple months. So maybe that they can keep working towards that. But really, I think as much as anything, it's not just about having the two of them play at their absolute peak. If that's both of them going like 30 and 10, it's not just having to ask both of them to do that. It's how the Mavericks build the roster around them, which is where I think we now pivot to talking about the new GM and everything. Is there, before I get into that, is there anything with KP you had that you wanted to add on?
No, I think we hit all that right there.
Sweet. Yeah, so getting into the Mavericks' new GM again, Nico Harrison, the Nike exec who has been recruited and pursued for years by multiple teams, finally comes in to Dallas. His takeaways at the press conference that I got were he seemed like it wasn't that he was soft spoken. It felt like he just didn't elaborate a whole lot. Like questions that were posed directly to him, I thought he gave short, pretty thoughtful answers, and other times he just kind of chimed in on the back of like what kids would say or something. Like if someone asked a question and said they were posing it to Kidd and Nico, Kidd would answer first, and then Nico would basically just say he's in agreement with Kidd or something to that effect. And it's not like I'm trying to say like, oh, he's not qualified. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying like it's interesting like in how much I thought it wasn't that enlightening. Like we don't walk away from it and say like, okay, I have a general idea of what kind of thing they're looking for, like a specific idea of the kind of players they're going to go try and get. It instead kind of made me wonder if between that and when Mark was asked about Bob Voulgaris, he basically deflected and said, I don't talk about who is or is not on the payroll. So that makes me wonder, like, has our situation really changed even though we have a new GM? Or is it a possibility that we are still in a quote-unquote, to cite the Tim Cato article, like the shadow GM scenario where Bob still has heavy influence, but Nico is kind of this more like front-facing figure with the history and the relationships built around it. But the actual focus and drive moving forward doesn't necessarily change from what we've previously seen. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you think I'm like, you can be honest if you think I'm just like off in like conspiracy theory here.
No, I think there's a few layers to it. First of all, there's a lot of mystery around Bob Voulgaris in terms of if remember, his contract was expiring this summer. We don't even know if really he's been re-signed, if he's still in the fold with the Mavericks. So there is that where it's like, Mark Cuban didn't necessarily have to fire him because his contract was expiring. So he had this like, I guess, a little bit of luxury where he could do something like that. So there's some mystery there. I think it's an interesting situation to kind of like monitor, but at the same time, I also think that it's a situation where the front office, like Mark Cuban talked about in the press conference too, when he said that, there's not a lot that has changed. It's still like the same hierarchy. And, I'm still the one making the final call because it's a lot of money, blah, blah, blah. Like he talked about all that stuff. And I think it's with there being the mystery around Bob Voulgaris, the really two main front office people that we do know of are Nico Harrison and Michael Finley. And I think those are the two that are going to work in conjunction in terms of player acquisition. Now, to your point about how Nico kind of like, answered questions or whatever in the press conference, I think there's a learning curve. You have to remember, this is not a guy who does media press briefings. Like he was a Nike rep who worked with a lot of players behind the scene. Like, he did his thing without having to field a bunch of questions and things like that. And there's definitely a learning curve to that. And, you could look at Dirk, you could look at Luka. Like those are guys that like, originally like what they knew was just playing basketball. And then once you become a pro and things like that, all of a sudden you have to talk after every game. You have to answer for the franchise, things like that.
Right.
And you learn those things as you go along. So my point in that is Nico still has a learning curve from the media standpoint of his job. I don't think that necessarily means anything one way or the other, good or bad, about what his actual job description. Like Luka was not great with the media, not in terms of like he was like rude or anything. He just wasn't very expansive and didn't really answer a lot of questions his rookie year. Doesn't mean he was any less of an incredible basketball player. So Nico can be an incredible GM just because he doesn't answer a ton of questions, at least right now, in press conferences, doesn't really say too much to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point for sure. It is a learning curve, and it is a little bit of a different environment, a little bit more public facing. Whereas I don't know how many casual fans were really aware of who this was. Like I saw plenty of people in the initial reaction to the announcement of his hiring, kind of saying like, "Who? Like who is this? Like a Nike executive? Like how does that make sense?" Instead of going and getting like a Danny Ainge or something like that. So yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I guess my only real issue and what made me kind of start to wonder, was Mark not like it would have been easy, I think, to kind of quell those concerns within the fan base regarding, Bob in that regard, if all he said was, if he just acknowledged like his contract is set to end this summer or something like that, even that still leaves wiggle room to like if a new deal or a new role or something is determined at that time. But instead, it just kind of is like, we're just going to continue to kind of not acknowledge the story and everything, and just kind of say like we won't confirm if he is or is not on the payroll or still has any influence within the team. I think that's where it kind of stemmed from concern. And then that's when I started thinking about Nico's answers and wondering like, what was that short enough? Not that he can't grow into it, but is it more of like a, here's your public facing figurehead now, and this guy's going to actually still be doing this stuff behind the scenes? Because I just don't want a scenario like we heard about in the fallout from Donnie Nelson, where teams are trying to do deals with the Mavericks, and apparently they're having conversations with each of them, and they're not even in agreement on what it is. And that's how you get like the confusion regarding the Goran Dragic Heat trade, when we thought briefly he was coming to Dallas, and then that ended up not happening. So I just don't want another repeat of that. I'd like to think that we at least have some sense of stability moving forward as a franchise.
Yeah, I mean, look, yes and no, because like at the same time, like it's not like the Mavericks were in a position where they didn't have stability. They were one of the most stable franchises in sports, not just the NBA, right? So stability is fine as long as it's stability is leading to progress. Like the Cowboys under Jason Garrett had incredible stability at the head coaching position. It doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
they were successful. And I think that's the one thing about even the Mavericks. Like, look, I think Rick Carlisle is an incredible coach, but at the bottom line, like it's been 10 years since he won a playoff series.
Yeah.
So like, yes, the stability was great. And, I think like at the end of the day, you have to. There's more than just what factors into a successful season or a successful campaign or like run for a franchise than just the stability of people in a position of power. So
Yeah.
I think the Mavericks were kind of due for a little bit of fresh change. It's just the way that it happened is kind of what left everyone um, you know, a little sour mouth and stuff.
Yeah. Well, speaking of fresh change and everything, one of the other big takeaways I had from the introductory press conferences was, aside from Luka and KP, obvious inclusions, the only really other Maverick named specifically was Josh Green. And there was another reporter who posed a question directly to Mark, asking kind of if the franchise is still high on the futures of guys like Tyrell Terry and Tyler Bay, to which Mark said yes, and don't forget Nate Hinton. And I kind of felt like, similar to what we were talking about earlier with regard to, if I don't know if posturing is too strong a word, but like regarding like the KP thing, it's almost like a situation where it's like, hey, we're going to tell everybody we love our guys and that we're really high on their futures, even though they didn't get a whole lot of experience last year, even though all of them are very young in that regard. And Tyrell Terry spent a lot of time last year away from the team as well. And it's like, aside from that, just know, like, if we, as we're reshaping our roster this summer, like, oh, if we're in a trade talk with you and suddenly we say, hey, we're interested in throwing in one or two of these guys, like, just know we're really high on these guys, and that's a big deal. Like, almost like that's how I kind of like read about it if I'm thinking about it in like a salesman pitch sort of thing, where it's like the salesman's having to be kind of honest or whatever. Like, it's not that I don't think that they're good players or that they could have good careers, but I think to try and sell the idea on like, oh, we're very high on all three of these guys, as young as they are and inexperienced, and if you want to add in Green, I felt like that was a little bit of posturing in that regard. Am I crazy, you think?
No, I would agree with that. I think, there's some element also of like, hey, look, like we know our roster top to bottom. We know, and there's some ego involved as well of like, hey, we drafted these guys. We know these guys. So, we're going to back them until like, it completely flames out or something. And I think that's not unique to the Mavericks or Mark Cuban or anything like that. Every franchise does that. But I think it's different when you mention these guys as opposed to when you
Mm-hmm.
mention KP. KP is a guy who you've seen, whether it be in New York, whether it be a couple of months in Dallas or anything like that. You've seen the results. Yeah, I would say with the young guys, it's not like any of these guys were highly touted coming in. Um, I think like if most of these guys flamed out, like I don't even think the Mavericks front office would be held to like some crazy high standard there of like, oh my god, can't, like, if Luka busted at number
Yeah.
3, that'd be a huge thing. If Josh Green busts late in the first round, or Nate Hinton or any of these guys, like no one's really thinking twice about that. It's one of those things where you talk in the moment, and then once the moment passes, it just kind of it becomes whatever. So yeah, I would agree that with the young guys, it is a bit of a posturing thing.
Yeah, the only thing I could think on that, like in terms of the front office not having its feet kind of held to the fire if they were to flame out, would be specifically like the good players that they passed over to make some of these picks, right? Like Sadiq Bey would be a good example of that in Detroit. And then they almost had wow, I just blanked on his name, Bane, in Memphis. Almost fell back to them in the second round, but guys like that they people thought they were going to take and that would be a good fit, and then they didn't take, and so those guys now having gone and succeeded, kind of like you hear with the Cowboys, right? Like, oh, they got this guy who didn't do a whole lot, like Gavin Escobar, second round pick, didn't do a whole lot. They could have had this running back instead, and he was a Pro Bowler. Like, you're going to hear some of those murmurs every now and then, grumbles, if you will, whenever those guys are doing big things. But yeah, I think for the most part, like you said, the difference is these are lower first round to early second round picks. And because of that, they don't carry the same weight, especially given how the NBA draft compares like the NFL draft in terms of depth and the number of rounds and the guys that you can find value throughout, in that case, like a 7-round draft. NBA pretty much, if you're not in a first round pick, you're pretty much icing on the cake if you're able to do something as a second round pick, or even more, an undrafted guy in that regard. So yeah, I think it's definitely a form of posturing. And as we were talking offline before we went live here, we were even saying, or you made the point of like, and for Mark, a guy who's been kind of maligned as a decision maker, he's what's left of that former brain trust. And so it could as well be a thing of like kind of not flexing, but yeah, that same sort of posturing thing, like in terms of like a basketball decision maker and evaluator in that regard. Guys that were tied to him, he's the last figurehead left of that brain trust, obviously. So maybe some of it there as well.
Yeah,
Hopefully I
for sure.
paraphrased that well.
Yeah, no, you're right, because like think about it, like you said, on that stage that day when the introductory press conference happened, like if not Mark, like who else is going to really back these guys? Like even when Jason Kidd was asked about what he wants to work on with Luka and things like that, even he said like I haven't even touched that car yet, like I haven't even done anything. So like if you don't even know what you're gonna do with Luka and you can't speak on that, like you're not gonna speak on Josh Green and Nate Hinton and things like that. So yeah, Mark Cuban had to do that. He was the only one that was going to do it. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, that's a great clarification, great point on that. Yeah, and it wasn't even like a criticism. The only thing that Kidd did say, like on the Luka front, like when asked about like what his weaknesses are, he's like, "Oh, it's not even a weakness, but he's 22," basically, like saying like it's not a weakness, but there's room to grow, and like the implied mature in that regard. Like that's about as safe and tepid as you could walk that line without coming across as criticizing in that regard. But yeah, that's great point regarding these guys not having a chance to evaluate and Mark being the only one who could possibly speak to that. So it'll be interesting. I'm really curious to see on that Kidd front, especially how that on-court dynamic works between Luka and Kidd. If we saw anything, and Kidd kind of acknowledged it himself in the press conference, his swim through Brooklyn and Milwaukee, even though he was highly respected by like Giannis, and we know like recently Dame wanted him in Portland before he got hired here, he wasn't, by his own admission, as hands-off as he probably needed to be. He took everything very seriously. He was kind of controlling whether it was the flow of the offense or a situational moment in the game. And with a guy like Luka, even Rick Carlisle understood, like, I can't I can't press too tightly. Like Popovich, same thing with Ginobili back in the day. I can't try to control too much because then I'm robbing him of what makes him special. And so in that regard, Kidd hopefully has learned that lesson because yeah, if you try and constrain Luka and limit his creativity to try and play more conventionally, I don't think that is the answer for how you get things moving in the right direction.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And I think also with Luca, like, just his responsibilities overseas right now and everything like that, there's just going to be a longer process. And the thing with the off season is you have time for all those things. So I don't think that, they need to be in any rush to do any of that either.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, like Luka obviously playing in the Olympics, taking Slovenia there for the first time in basketball. While Kidd couldn't really work with him right now because of that, and that does somewhat limit their ability to work one-on-one and things like that right now, KP does not have that limitation. I'm just curious of like your temperature on this. Would you feel more at ease and especially trusting in, like I said, the Mavericks' sincere belief that they actually think it can be salvaged and still make good on all the promise the Luka-KP tandem posed when they first acquired him? If Kidd was working out or something with KP, whether especially if he has to actually go, I think KP's back in Latvia at this point. I'm speculating just based on that interview yesterday, which was an in-person one. Would you feel better about their sincerity and that commitment to it and the likelihood of it succeeding if you saw that, like kind of like how Rick would travel to Slovenia for Luka?
Um, yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just more about what you like. All those gestures, they all like they're all done. Like, Greg Popovich did it with Duncan traveling to his islands and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And like those are all gestures done out of goodwill, and it's all good stuff. But at the end of the day, it's all about what you're doing on the basketball court and what you're installing in the system in the 82 games of the NBA regular season. Like you could do all the traveling to another country and meeting families and stuff like that. But then if at the end of the day, if you're going to ask an all-star player to be a decoy in the playoffs, like he's not going to be sitting there between game 3 and game 4 and being like, wait, this guy traveled across the world to see me. He's going to be pissed
Sure.
off. So I think to answer your question though, I do think that the duo of Luka and KP can be salvaged, and I don't think that it's really gone too far south. We magnify things because of how everyone views. Like we've been talking about Luka potentially leaving since like he got here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like so the fact that this dialogue goes is at such a rapid pace, I think it's built up in the media and the public perception a lot more than reality. I don't think that there is that much danger. And also, like, I just think that at the end of the day, like I said, we're not too far removed from these guys showing that they can make it work. I also think that there has to be other pieces around them too that can take the attention away from a lot of those things. Like so, what we saw the Clippers play throughout the playoffs, and even before Kawhi got hurt, you had Kawhi and Paul George, and Paul George would struggle sometimes. Then Kawhi would be out with an injury, whatever. But you had guys like Reggie Jackson, Marcus Morris. You had these guys step up and kind of take the attention away from Paul George's struggles, from Kawhi's
Mm-hmm.
injury, whatever. The problem is the Mavericks haven't had that. Like they have fine complementary pieces, but they don't have guys that, hey, if KP's going to disappear for a couple of games, like, look, Maxi's doing great, Dorian's doing great, whatever, and it kind of takes the attention away, and it kind of beats down the topic of how well is KP playing, how is he flowing with Luka. That's when you start seeing stories about, oh my God, did they high five after they made a bucket, and like that's where these things start coming up because the Mavericks just don't have anything else left in the tank, anyways.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point as well. I think on the goodwill gesture thing that, like you mentioned, like with Popovich and guys like that doing that, and even Carlisle previously, I agree it's not going to be something with like a long term sort of implication. But I think what makes this unique is the fact that it is a new coach. There is that turmoil existing kind of with KP right now and his frustrations as it relates to how he was utilized. And so I think it would mean more like right now versus wherever we are next year or something in that instance, or even if Rick had visited him last offseason. I think it would mean more in this case because it's like it's an attempt to kind of reach out and like steady things that are very much uncertain right now. And it would be some kind of indication, I think, from the franchise that they are in fact committed to him, and it's not just posturing at that point. Now, perhaps it still would be, but it would seem less likely as posturing. It's either less, or it's just like, well, you're posturing the hell out of this while also still working to shop them on the back end. So I feel like there's a little bit more in this case that I think in this scenario it would mean more than a normal given year.
Yeah, I think so. And like you said, all the circumstances just add up to a whole different situation. So I agree. Like it would, I don't like, yeah, mean more. It would just be, it's just different because it's not someone who's inherited you. You're inheriting that other coach. So I think at the end of the day, like, yeah, they're coach, player, whatever, things like that. They're human beings, and so like you definitely feel the value when you have something like that happen. So I think that's a very valid point, and that it would mean a lot. Um, but like I said, it's more about what happens once KP gets here. I don't want to oversell just the point of visiting in the off season and things of that
Yeah.
sort.
No, that's fair. I'm curious to see how things work when free agency rolls around because this team does need to make some major adjustments, and this is, I think, as crucial an offseason as we've seen in Mavericks history. Like, I really think they need to make a drastic change, either a major acquisition or they need to make several very quality additions that are just smart with their cap space and everything like that. Because really, the only guys at this point, like Luka's the only untouchable, of course, we know that. But really, even then, I would say maybe if you're really committed to the idea of it working with KP and Luka in this new kind of regime, as it were, then okay, maybe you have two in that regard, unless it's just a complete knock your socks off deal for KP. But everyone else is basically up for grabs. There is no one untouchable. Like you've seen at times people on like Mavs Twitter say like Maxi and Jalen and Dorian, like, no, I don't want to part with them. Like in these hypothetical trade scenarios people put out there, and if they see those names mentioned, it's a we like our guys kind of scenario. And it's like you can't marry to something you like. It's got to be like a perfect fit or something you love. Like you have to be willing to upgrade it. And I understand that the franchise wanted to cultivate some continuity as they had so much like post title, so much influx with the roster from year to year. But I think while they've done a good job developing guys like Maxi and Dorian, it's also important to kind of understand there aren't a whole lot more levels I think that they can go. Maxi's already a very good, when healthy, perimeter defender, versatile in that regard, and he shot over 40% from three. So it's like, do you have a whole lot more higher you can ask him to reach? Like a guy like Dorian is playing great. He's 27, 28 years old, I think, at this point. Hell, he might even be a little older than that now that I think about it. But it's like, I think at some point you have to be open to saying, like, you don't only trade your scraps to get good players in return. The whole point of how you make a trade, in almost all circumstances, is you got to give up something you value that offsets what the other team is giving up, generally. So I think you have to look at it and say, with this franchise needing to make several key moves, anybody can be moved. No one is a guaranteed to be here next offseason. And whatever the Mavericks are able to do, they have to really commit to it, because another lackadaisical kind of approach like we've seen recent years in free agency, I don't think that's going to cut it. I don't think you can wait for the 1 and 2 tier guys to move and then try to move on some bargain bin shopping.
Yeah, and also the other thing is, again, going back to Nico, we don't really know what the approach is going to be. Like in the past, when Donnie was in charge, you could look at this and be like, all right, we know that free agency is not going to be the main route in terms of player acquisition. Donnie is a trader. Like that's what he does. He trades in season, he trades in the off season, he trades in the draft. That's how you got Dirk. That's how you got Luka. That's how you got Jay Kidd when he was a player. That's how you got Jason Terry. I mean, all the Tyson Chandler. You go down the list, like he got all these guys through trades. We don't really know what the approach is going to be with Nico Harrison. I think that's going to be the big thing. But I agree with you that like some of these role players, they've kind of hit their cap,
Hmm.
and I think that when you have guys like that, that have already kind of like hit their potential, you have to ask yourself what direction you're going, what direction you're going as a franchise, and how far do you think that you still need to go in terms of roster construction, that can kind of take you to the next level. You already have a guy like Luka who basically alone dragged you to Game 7 against the Clippers.
Yep.
You're really not that far off. And again, going back to the NBA Finals this year, you look at the Phoenix Suns. This is a team. The same year that Luka was drafted, they were the worst team in the NBA that previous season. That's how they got DeAndre Ayton #1. The
Hmm.
year after that, they were like one slot better. Even last year, they missed the playoffs. Now they're in the NBA Finals because they went and got that key piece, which was Chris Paul. And so, yeah, I think that's what the Mavericks have to do. They have to identify what that missing piece is, and then after that, now they have the whole nother, I guess, window of mystery of just like, what, how are you going to acquire this person? Are you going to try to woo them in free agency? Are you going to try to strike a trade? That's what nobody is really going to know until it actually happens with Nico.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a big part of that is they got to find a way to put less burden on Luca, not just in the scoring department. You can't ask him to, get you to a game 7, have him drop like 46 or whatever it was, and you're still losing by double digits. Like you can't have that kind of scenario where the Mavericks, other shooters other than Luca in that game, go like 3 or 5, whatever it was, of 25 from 3. That's not going to cut it. But like this was a tweet from Kevin Gray Jr. a few days ago talking about this past season, Luka's usage rates. He was number 1 in usage rate at 35.9%, number 1 in time of possession, 8.9 seconds on average, number 5 in touches, number 3 in seconds per touch, 4 in value over replacement player, and 9 in player efficiency rating. So like crazy high usage. You can't put that much burden on him, even at 22 years old. You can't just continually put that much burden on him, and that's why guys who are intriguing are, you mentioned like Chris Paul, a veteran point guard who is able to come in and make a big impact. Mark Stein talked about the possibility of like a Kyle Lowry to Dallas, whether that'd be like a 2 or even a 3-year deal in that regard. I think that would be a very smart move where you are bringing in that kind of veteran, in this case, championship experience, and a guy that can lighten the load a little bit. It doesn't even have to be like, how does this work? How is this perfectly fit throughout the entirety of the year? Because as you saw, like with Chris Paul in Houston, you get to the playoffs and it's like, hey, if Luka's going off in this case and they're basically teeing off and trying to limit him in any way you can, now you have that counter punch. It feels like Dallas doesn't have the counter punch right now. And I think because of that, you don't have a capable, consistent guy that can take over in that number 2 spot. Even if you want to say like KP has that scoring potential, it's still, I think you need a guy that can create as well to kind of help control the game. And that's just something that they don't have right now. Even in small spurts, like Brunson can do it in small spurts, but it's not the same as like having a perennial all-star championship caliber point guard like Lowry. So yeah, I'm curious to see what they do in that front. But as long as they're active and you can kind of make sense of it, like active and doing something that is multiple moves, so you see the roster kind of reforming, restructuring, then I'm willing to kind of buy in fully. Otherwise, it kind of feels like it's just running back largely the same crew, which is not, I think, a viable option at this point, even with more growth from Luka. It feels like they're too near their cap, where it's like at best you're talking about a playoff series win. And the Suns, like you said, very aggressive, made a bold move, and it paid dividends no matter what happens the rest of the series in the finals.
Yeah, exactly. And also those kind of players that you're talking about, they don't grow on trees.
No.
So it's like that's why you need the acumen that you have in the front office, whether that was what Donnie brought or what now I guess what they think Nico is going to bring. You have to find a way to get these guys in here, and there's only a limited supply of them throughout the league. And that's the thing. I mean, that's enough to go back to where our conversation began today. That's why you really need KP to pan out, because think about it. We're like, if you go back 3 years or whatever it was, 2.5 years, we all thought KP was that guy. We all thought that he was that superstar who was stuck in the typical Knicks position, and all he needed was a change of scenery, and he's going to pop off and kind of become Dallas's version of LeBron and Anthony Davis, even though that hadn't happened yet. But basically that, and that just hasn't happened. So, when you strike and miss, what ends up happening is you lose multiple first-round picks. You sign the guy to a 5-year, $58 million deal or something like that, and then you suffer. So you can't miss on these too often. It really does sink your franchise.
Oh, for sure. And I know at the ticket, I think Bob Sturm raised this a few weeks back. Raised kind of the point of like, we were all at the time terrified of the idea of KP just doing the player option. It would have been like a $4 million player option if he had qualifying offer. That's what it was, qualifying offer. If he had just picked that up instead of signing a max contract with the Mavericks, but instead you had this kind of push to like lock him down, which made sense at the time, but it was also, to Bob's point at the time, he hadn't played in a year. Like, can we see him at least go through the warm-up line? Can we get some kind of view of how he's moving, how he's feeling, and all of that before we hitch the wagon, as it were? And yeah, when it's been there in Dallas, it's been great, and it's been exactly what you signed up for. The problem is it's been very little of that and a lot of nicked up injuries here and there, a lot of ankle or knee soreness, things like that. Back tightness as well, I think, was another one that cropped up a few times. So it's very much like you said earlier, make or miss. Like, if he's playing up to par, you don't have this uncertainty and you feel much better about the position. Instead, you're trying to sell on, but we have Luka, and what if KP? And that's a harder sell because it has that uncertainty.
Absolutely. I agree.
So, all right. Well, I think that about wraps up for the time we have here. But Saad, thank you for joining me again. Always a pleasure to have you on here and talk Mavericks. It's going to be a very interesting off season once free agency kicks off here in like a week, 10 days. Everything is a blur right now. But it's going to be very interesting, and we'll definitely have to get you on again sometime when your schedule and everything allows. And we'll see what we make of that, whether it's, as Jason Bryant points out, a signing like Richaun Holmes, which I think would be a great signing, and another one that's you're going to have to spend, but it's not like you have to like completely blow out your cap to make something like that work. So whether it's a move like that or whether it is a splashier signing of a DeRozan or a Lowry or something to that effect, we'll see. But I feel pretty confident they're going to be bold this offseason simply out of necessity.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. So if you guys haven't already, drop a like, leave a comment below, subscribe to the Dallas Prospect. Be sure to check out Saad's work with The Athletic and hear him on 1310 96.7 FM The Ticket as well. And until next time, guys, peace.
This is my time.